Welcome back to the McCann Dogs podcast. This is episode 53, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Now, if you've been listening to our podcast for a while, we will often have a topic and we'll chat about it, and then we usually get lots of great questions from our audience, whether it's our podcast audience or our Facebook audience or YouTube or whatever. We'd love to answer some of those questions today. And joining me this week, as she does every week, is the Director of Online Training for the My Dog Can program. It's Instructor Shannon Viljasu. And thanks for joining us, Shannon.
Hey, happy to be here. Hi, everybody.
So we are going to jump into some of your questions today, and there's a variety of things on here, and I think any dog owner is going to be able to pull a little bit from this, and maybe you've asked some of these questions yourself, but today it's all about you. We're going to be answering your questions on the podcast. I'm Ken Steep, and welcome back to McCann Dogs. Now, Shannon, with the amount of students that we get to see every week, we get so many awesome questions. And this is, it's really sort of been the foundation for our podcast, or been the foundation for our YouTube channel, is, getting these great questions and then thinking to ourselves, that is something that everyone can probably benefit from.
Yeah, definitely. And I put the call out to Facebook for some more questions for our podcast, and I got so many great questions. I thought we need to do a whole episode to answer all these questions. All right, let's do that. That's fun.
Yeah, for sure. So let's without wasting too much time here, let's get right into some of our questions. Now, we pulled these directly from the McCann Dogs Facebook page, and I'll post a link in the show notes below, or if you're watching this on our YouTube podcast, I'll put a link in the description to our Facebook page, because I think this is going to be something that we'd like to more regularly do, sort of put the call out. Do you have any questions? And then have a chat about it on our podcast. So the first question comes to us from Ann Robertson, and Ann asks or says, our Freddie listens well and behaves while he's on a house line or leash. When he's not on a line or a leash, he is as independent as a toddler. Any suggestions? And this is a great one. And this is something that I experienced when I was training with McCann Professional Dog Trainers, until someone gave me some sage advice, which is the sage advice that we're going to talk about today. So what's your response to Ann's question, Shannon?
Definitely. So first off, thanks for the question, Ann. It really is a great one. And it's one that a lot of people struggle with, because it's not necessarily intuitive to expect to work through taking the leash or the line off as sort of a training wheels scenario. So if you think about training wheels, as you're learning to ride a bike, they're there and they're solid. So you've got 3 good wheels to balance on, and then you move the wheels up a little bit. Rather than taking them right off and hoping you don't fall over, you move the wheels up a little bit, maybe an inch at a time. So if you do topple a little bit to the side, there's something to grab you there. And that's what we want to do with our dogs as well. So that question sort of answers itself. Basically, taking the leash off and throwing it away is the equivalent of taking those training wheels off and just hoping for the best and hoping you don't fall. What I like to do with my young dogs is I like to have a really cheap long line that I use for being out and about. And really cheap because I can cut off bits of it. So what I'll do is I'll start with a 20-foot long line. And if I am happy with the listening that I'm getting on that 20-foot long line, then I might cut off, 2 or 3 feet initially. So now I've got a 17-foot long line. So it's still there, but it's a little bit less. And if I'm still happy with the level of listening I'm getting over a couple of different periods outside, or walks or hikes or whatever they may be, then I'll think about cutting back even more, until I get down to the point where my dog is really just dragging a short line. And the other part of this equation is to make sure that you're still doing the same training and having the same expectations as you're weaning away from those training tools. So the last thing we want to do is start cutting back the long line, but think, well, I've already done my training with the long line on, so now I'm just going to coast and keep testing and see how the dog does. I'm still going to get in there and do the repetition of things that I want my dog to be proficient at. So I'm still going to work my long recalls with that long line even shorter to make sure that my dog still understands as the line gets lighter, he still understands the expectation and the listening skills are the same. So what I would suggest at this point, Anne, is take a step back in your training rather than going out and just taking the long line off and saying, oh, he's not listening now. Work through weaning away from that long line, sort of like a training wheel scenario, and you will get a much, much better response. It'll take a little bit longer, but of course, the end goal being that the dog listens, you're going to get that result much better because you have the opportunity to go in and back things up if your dog doesn't listen, and they've still got enough long line on that you can get in there and you can effectively train the dog.
Something I also think is really important when you're using a leash, when you're using a long line, and something that we talk about so often because we really want our dogs to feel like they get to choose, they get to make a choice, and then we follow up giving them the information that they're either right or wrong, is being aware of your leash tension. If you're, whatever exercise you're doing, you can accidentally make your dog very leash aware. If there's always a little bit of tension on that leash, if whether it's guiding them while you're walking or especially training your recall. If you have tension on that line, your dog is always in the back of their mind sniffing a distraction or looking at something, and they're thinking, I can feel that there's a little pull here and something is about to happen. So be really, really aware of that tension in your leash. And that was something that I struggled a little bit with, especially when it came to walking on leash when I was teaching Deegan many, many years ago, is that I always was ready to, interrupt her pulling or, turn her away. And I wasn't really being self-aware of how much pressure I was putting on that leash. So when you're training with a leash or you're training with a long line, you want the clip of that leash or long line to be hanging down. You want there to be some slack there. You don't want it to be excessive, but you do need to allow your dog to feel like they are off leash if you want to truly have that same response down the road when you don't have a leash on them. But that was something that was just sort of something that I clearly remember. And I remember the instructor when I was a student at McCann Dogs coming over and talking to me about that. And now becoming a trainer and having seen so many dogs, it's amazing how powerful that little piece of information can be when it comes to getting a reliable behavior from your dog.
Absolutely. And that's probably one of the most used lines around here. I would be hard pressed to find a day where we have students come through the building where I haven't uttered those words. Oh, loosen up on that leash. So important. Excellent point.
Now, the next question comes to us from Steph Evelyn. And this is a very common question, especially for new puppy owners who, maybe already have a dog in the house, or people who really want to have their dog socialize somewhere. And Steph Evelyn asks, what is the best way to introduce dogs to each other?
Yeah. So there's a lot of variables to this scenario. So I'm going to give a bit of a broad overview, and I'm also going to point out that we just recorded a podcast on when one is not enough, when you want to bring multiple dogs into your household, which really elaborates on things that you should do, things that you should be aware of when you are bringing another dog into the home. If you've got an older dog and a young puppy that you're trying to introduce the young puppy into the household, I always make sure that I err on the side of caution of not overwhelming my other dogs. So again, we spent a lot of time on that blog and on that podcast talking about the different aspects of this, but basically I don't let them spend a lot of time together because puppies are hard to deal with sometimes. They can be really, really tough on an older dog in the house. Those needle teeth are really sharp and they use them quite efficiently. And we don't want to put our older dogs in a position where they are so put out by the puppy that they have no choice but to tell the puppy off. And of course, that creates a dangerous scenario in the home. So I like to have a lot of skills on my puppies, at least a response to name. I have a long line on them all the time so that they can't be too obnoxious with the older dogs, but I like to be able to control the scenario so I can stop the puppy at any point from overwhelming the older dog or older dogs in the house. I don't ever want them to take the scenario into their own hands. If you're introducing older dogs to one another, the best way to do it is really to get them together and go for a little walk with them together. Let them get used to each other's presence first, not a walk where they're rough and tumble together, but a walk where they're both under control, in a heel position, and they're not necessarily allowed to interact yet. See how they do with each other's presence. And if you think that they're going to to get along well, if they've been fine for the walk, then you can allow some quick sniffing on loose leads. Be very careful that you're not tightening the leash at all. We don't want to change the dog's body posture, and we don't want to put the dog in a position where we are putting any tension into the situation. It can cause all sorts of problems if you are letting dogs greet on tight leashes. So make sure that it's a quick greeting. Make sure that both dogs have good response to name, so that on a loose lead you can call their name and turn them away from each other if you start to see any tension. And I would also, as much as possible, try to educate yourself on body language so that you can recognize really early on if one dog is put off by the interaction, or if one dog is getting, really pumped or stimulated about the interaction, and you can stop it before it turns into anything other than just body language.
I remember maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, we did a live stream on our YouTube channel, and Instructor Steve made a point where he said, the older dog didn't get a choice here. It was your decision to bring another dog home. So forcing the issue isn't a good idea. And I really love the advice where you mentioned with maybe older dogs is that you go and take them out together on leash, where you have lots of control. I can think of lots of situations where I've met someone and I've thought to myself, I don't really know if I like this person. And if I were forced to have some kind of relationship with them, it would be really awkward and difficult. But, given some time, you can choose to either, spend more time with them or not. And I think that's something we really need to remember, that not every dog needs to be best friends, but to give them the best opportunity to have a good relationship, you need to slowly introduce them to each other. I really like that. Now, the next question, again, it's another great question from Ann Robertson, and she asks, any miracle solution to stop the neighbor's dogs from charging the fence and barking uncontrollably at us when the owner thinks it's normal?
Yeah, the miracle solutions are usually in short supply, so that's a tricky one. If the neighbor is not willing to work with you, and I'm sort of getting that idea if you're asking how to stop that dog without necessarily having said anything about the neighbors themselves and what they're willing to do. So if they're willing to help you with that, that's great. You guys together can work through. It would be a great training scenario for both dogs to come out into the yard on leash and work through some calming ritual exercises in the yard with each other. As far as miracle solution, what I did with my own house, the one side of my yard is chain link fence and the rest is all privacy fencing. And in the chain link fence, when I first moved in, there were 3 boxers that lived next door that liked to do exactly that thing. And my middle child at the time, Tyler, was pretty excited about that whole thing, and he would also get right into it and be excited. So I wanted to stop that scenario, and of course if I was out there and I could stop him with my voice, that was great. But if I wasn't in the yard supervising, I had no control over the situation. So I actually took tarps and strong ties, and I put tarps up along that chain link fence just to create a visual barrier, so that when those 2 dogs were out, the visual aspect didn't trigger them charging the fence. It was simply that the noise that would sometimes get them going and get them excited, but it wasn't as stimulating once the visual was gone. So hopefully that's a helpful scenario for you. It definitely worked in my case, and then the neighbors moved and took their boxers, and that solved that problem completely. So there's another miracle solution, but I'm not sure how easy that one will be to attain, to kick your neighbors out.
No, I totally agree. I think that's a great solution. And I think, maybe if it were me, my first step might be go have a chat. I don't know what her relationship is like with her neighbors, but say, anytime I'm out in the backyard with my dogs, your dogs are barking and going crazy. And maybe, hopefully the owner just isn't aware of it. I mean, and I don't know what their specific case is, but, maybe communicating that problem with your neighbor, maybe, a step in the right direction for that solution. Again, it's hard to say specifically whether that'll work for Anne or not, but that might be my first step, is just sort of help your neighbor to be aware of it. And that's, hopefully will help things out.
That would definitely be the best solution, because then you can get out there and do some training and you can work through it, and you'll both be that much better off for it.
Yeah, for sure. Caitlin Morganweg asks, best way to stop barking at people when they come over. And I think my first question would be, Caitlin, why are you barking at people? But I know what she's trying to ask here. And what would be your advice for Caitlin with her dogs barking at people when they come over?
This is a great question. So I'm going to guess that the dog is probably a little bit put off by the people coming into the house, which is why they're barking, rather than excited and stimulated. But I would probably address both of those things in a very similar way. And that would be to train the dog to be calm in the house. You can also work with things like management, right? So if you have a dog that is so worried about strangers coming into the house that they're going to be barking and tail tucked and making a scene in that scenario, I would remove the dog from that situation, because that will stop the rehearsal of the behavior. And that's always the first thing you want to do in any sort of behavior modification, is stop the rehearsal. Rehearsal will predict behavior because it builds that library in the dog's head that says, this is what we do in this scenario. So what you need to do is you need to stop the dog from doing that same thing each and every time. So if that means when I am expecting somebody to come over, I will remove the dog and put them in a crate with a nice chewy so that they're out of the way. And then once things have settled, and maybe it's a guest coming into my house that is somebody that I can work with my dog with, and maybe it's not. So if it's somebody that I don't mind saying, okay, I'm going to train my dog while you're here, I will go and get the dog, bring him out on leash, and I'll work on something calming and stationary. I really, really like using go to your bed exercise for these sorts of scenarios, for a calm thing in the house. And I would probably do that rather than having the dog try to greet the person and then maybe fall back into the habit of starting to bark again, especially if they're concerned about the person. I would just do the go to your bed, and I would instruct the person as well, just ignore the dog. He's not going to stop barking if you want to greet him, that sort of thing. So let's just let him be comfortable. We'll let you be comfortable, and we'll get him used to the scenario that there's a person in the house, and my job is not to bark at them and ward them off. My job is to go and lie down and relax on my bed. So obviously you need to have control of the dog, leash on, bring them over to the bed, work on your go and lie down exercise, and really reinforce that. Make sure that when you're working that go and lie down or go to your bed exercise, it's not only when there's the stimulation of a guest coming into the house. You need to make sure you take the time to train that behavior first. So I would spend a lot of time teaching my dog, go to your bed, lie down. The time where I sit in the evening and watch TV, for example, is a time that I spend a lot of training my young puppies to go and lie down on their bed so that I have that calm behavior. And all of my adult dogs know when I say go to your beds, they all go to their beds, they lie down, they chill out. They've usually got a toy close by, a Kong or a Chewy of some sort, and they can occupy themselves with those behaviors. If I want to make sure they're more securely away and out of the situation, I'll use my crates. So depending on the scenario with your dog, I would first take the stimulation out of the equation and teach them an alternate behavior. That go and lie down is going to be a great one. And then if it's a situation where you think, okay, you know what, the dog was just excited barking to see the person, now that they've calmed down, they'll probably be fine, then you can certainly, okay, go and say hello and let that greeting happen at that point, but be prepared to stop it if that barking does get a rise again.
And this is something we often mention, is setting your dog up to be successful, and what an important thing that can be. And when we talk about whether it's barking at someone coming in the house, or maybe it's submissive peeing, or maybe it's jumping up, I mean, all of these things can be, you can put yourself in a good position to be successful by a little bit of management, whether it's in your crate or on your bed, and then you can treat it as a training scenario. So I love that. I love that approach. I know we have a video on our YouTube channel about teaching your dog to go lie down on their bed, and I know that something that people can use a lot more often. It's not just a trick for only when you're sitting on the couch, or when you want to show your friends that your dog will go onto their bed. It's a really valuable behavior to have to set your dog up to be right. So I love using that, and I can think of so many different times when having your dog to go lie on their bed or in a place can be really, really helpful for your training.
Yeah, I use that so much in my house, so much more than any other cue. Go and lie down is because when you have multiple dogs, sometimes they get in the way. So that go and lie down command is so, so valuable. I definitely recommend it for anybody.
For sure. Next question comes from Rachel Bata. She asks, my dog has been given a rabies vaccine as a pup and again a year later. Is there immunity now? Can I get a teeter test done to check? And where can I get this? And she also asks, how can my dog contract rabies? Do I need to vaccinate for an indoor dog of 6 pounds?
So as far as vaccinating or not vaccinating, it is mandated in Ontario that all dogs must be vaccinated for rabies by a certain age. So that is something that you need to consider, whether the dog's indoors or outdoors. I mean, certainly there's a lower risk. However, again, it is law. Talk to your vet. That's definitely the first step that I would take with any vaccine protocol, is talk to the vet. As far as the level of immunity, the only way to actually tell whether or not your dog has acquired immunity from a vaccination is to titer. With a rabies titer, it's a very expensive proposition in Ontario. I actually just recently did one with my youngster Ned, and I'm just waiting on the results. And it was somewhere around $300 for that, because there's very few places that are actually doing rabies titers. It needed to be shipped down somewhere in the States, and it escapes my mind at this moment. But definitely, if you want those answers, and with me, I don't ever want to just trust that because I've vaccinated, my dog is going to have adequate immunity. So I will actually titer after all of their vaccinations. I'll wait a little bit of time, and then I'll do a titer to make sure that they are adequately protected. There's a little bit of an assumption out there, I think, that people assume that just because they've done the vaccination has taken hold and is perfect and is good, and the dog will be safe. And unfortunately, that's not the case. There are situations where there's interference, where, there's dogs who just sort of will fight off that vaccination for whatever reason, and the adequate immunity doesn't take hold. So if you want to know with 100% certainty, then you need to go back to the vet. You need to talk to them about when they would recommend you do the titer with that dog. And you also need to put out much more money than the vaccine costs to do the titer test to see if there's adequate immunity there. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight. I don't feel comfortable giving you a definite answer on that because I'm not a veterinary professional, but from my experience, if you want to know for certain, definitely the titer is the way to go, but be prepared. They are still really pricey. Actually, only the rabies is the one that's really pricey. The other ones are very reasonable.
Even with that cost, still worth knowing, being sure 100%. And making sure your dog is protected is really, really important.
Absolutely.
Savannah Emanuel asks how to train your dog to stay in his or her bed while in the house.
Hi, Savannah. Great question. We actually have a great video on YouTube about that. If I were to give you a really quick answer to that, I would say build value for that position. So build value for being on that bed. Like I said, I usually will train my young dogs in the TV time that I have in the evenings. I'll train them with your go to your bed cue, and I'll have lots of yummy treats in my pocket. I'll guide them to the bed, go and lie down, give them a bone to chew on while they're there. And then every once in a while from the couch, I'll toss them a treat. So it's not a big procession that I'm getting up and going to them to reinforce. But every once in a while, there's this random cookie that comes flying. And my older dogs love it when I have a puppy, because then they get random cookies too, because I feel bad leaving them out. So that's always a nice proposition. So yeah, just train it. Look for that video on our YouTube channel. You can search for it, and we'd love to see how you're progressing with it.
Yeah, and I'll post a link in the description or in the show notes of this podcast so that you guys can check out that video if you're listening or watching it on YouTube. Now, something that I'd quickly mention is that you can very quickly build value quite simply by starting with that bed close to wherever you're sitting. So I love Shannon's example where she's watching TV. I think that's such a great time to be multitasking, especially nowadays that we're so accustomed to like second screening and we want to be as efficient as we can, but you can have your puppy's bed very near wherever you're sitting. That way you can easily reinforce them and then over time move it a little bit farther away. But if you'd like a little bit more in-depth training on this, I'll post a link below the episode. Diane Duffy asks, I would like to help my old Boston Bulldog learn to be self-soothing so I don't have to play with him all the time when we're indoors. Outside he's fine. Inside he gets all stressed because he doesn't know what to do. And then she asks, how did she find us on the podcast?
Thanks so much for the question, Diane. So with the idea that the house is, you want the house to be a little bit more structured, I would concentrate on structured activities. So rather than just coming into the house and letting the dog be loose, I would come into the house and maybe crate the dog some of the time, maybe use your go and lie down on the bed cue, do sit stays, down stays. You can do some enrichment work too, so that it's not just structure and boring exercises. It's things that are going to mentally tire the dog out. So you've probably seen lots of enrichment games and activities, the bottles with food in them, things like that will go a long way to sort of taking that mental edge off the dog and helping them to calm down in situations where they should be just more relaxed. So I guess my recommendation would be to apply some more structure to the things in the house. So rather than playing with him and entertaining him, think about activities that he can be entertained on his own that don't necessarily involve you. And then you can cut back on the time that you have to consistently play with him in the house. Of course, I'm sure you don't want to drop that entirely, because you probably want to play with your dog, but we don't want to have that be a demand all of the time. So some structured activities, some stimulation activities that will have him thinking and working through that on his own and not necessarily having to play with you, that should go a long way for you.
And that'll really lead to some great relationship building exercises and some really important leadership exercises, because rather than focusing on the quantity of time that your dog is spending with you and maybe out of their crate, you're focusing on the quality of time, what you're doing with that time, and really teaching your dog that anytime they do have free time, that they can listen to you and they can do something enjoyable. But when it's time, when you're busy or distracted or you have something else to do, that they can rest comfortably in their crate, knowing that the next time that they come out, they can do something with you. So I really like that advice for a lot of different reasons. I think it's really, a great way to have build in an off switch for your dog. And I know that's something that we do with each and every one of our own personal puppies that come into our household. It's really nice to have them just go hang out and relax. But when they come out, it's all about having fun with us. Alice Rupp asks, I am struggling to train my dog to not eat goose and deer poop. And this is a pretty common question we get when it comes to, outdoor scenarios where someone really doesn't have like a leave it command or has like sort of moderate control, verbal control of their dog, because they're in a position where they can't really follow up. They're struggling to be able to train their dog through this scenario. So what advice would you have for Alice, who's struggling to train her dog not to eat goose and deer poop?
Yeah, so it would be twofold. Definitely the training needs to be brought back front and center. So if at any point you have a dog that wanders off and grabs something that they shouldn't eat when out and about, and they won't relinquish it to you, they won't drop it from a distance, they won't bring it to you if you call them to you, that is a very dangerous scenario. So I would definitely, as quickly as you can, get back to a little bit of a training mode. I would put a long line on that dog, and I would work response to name and recall ad nauseum. And I would also work on the leave it cue, because that one is a real lifesaver. I actually have several cues with my dogs when it comes to dropping things or leaving them. I have leave it, which means don't pick it up to begin with. And hopefully that's something that I've spotted first, and I've been able to tell my dog leave it. But I also have a drop it command, where if he has picked up something, we're out on a trail and I look over to see where my dog is and he's got a big deer bone in his mouth or something like that, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to try to wrestle that out of my dog's mouth. So I can say out, and my dog will drop that right away. I also play a game when I'm out and about with my dogs, whenever they pick things up. And I have retrievers, which means that they are so tactile with their mouths. Nettie, my youngster, his biggest joy is just grabbing something and running around with it in his mouth, because that's what he was bred to do. So I will, if I see them pick up a stick or something like that on the trail, actually, I wrote a blog post about this too. I just remembered that. I will say, bring it here, let me see. And they have learned that that means they bring it to me, I pick it up or take it out of their mouth, and I'm looking at it. And I usually give them a big cookie, or I give them a big play session or something of that nature. And then I give them the stick back. As long as it's something safe, I want to let my dog know that you bringing me something is never going to be a confrontation. I'm not going to wrestle it away from you. I'm not going to take it away from you. I'm not going to try to chase you down and steal it from you. I want my dog to willingly say, oh yeah, I'd love to bring that to you. And I, interestingly enough, I always find it funny that I've had my dogs bring me things like deer bones, because we tend to go down into a ravine that has a lot of very fun wildlife down there. So they'll bring, little hides that they find, or there's tennis balls down there a lot for some reason. So there must be other dogs playing down there. I always assume other dogs. Maybe people are playing tennis down there. I don't know.
Who are you? Who are you to judge? Who are you to judge where people play tennis?
Exactly. But I use those to my advantage. And I always laugh because my dog will give up this really enticing deer bone for a piece of kibble, for example. And it's like they gave me $1 million and I gave them a nickel back. Hey, that's a win-win. But my dog still thinks, because it's been patterned, my dog still thinks, oh, this is a really great game. And they don't concentrate on giving up the item. They concentrate on the idea that it's a great thing to bring me items. So I would get back to your training and work those things into it. So if they pick up benign things that you're not worried about, you can work that, bring it here, let me see, but always have a long line or a leash on so that you can, without having to chase the dog, because you won't be able to catch them. You won't be able to wrestle it out of their mouth at some point. You definitely need to have that safety net in place that saves the dog if they've got something dangerous to pick up, and you can't rely on physically getting there. So long line on until the training is completed, and make sure that you're putting in lots of hours of lots of practice hours of repetition with that out cue in as many scenarios as you can, and with the leave it cue as well. That one is so important.
Well, and just for a minute, let's talk about one scenario that you had with your young puppy. I remember you talking about, I think the M&R had dropped rabies bait pouches. So, yeah. That sense of urgency, it's not just goose or deer poop. It could be something that's really dangerous. And I think that might be a good example to mention here.
Definitely. Yeah. The Ministry of Natural Resources had dropped those rabies packages to try to immunize the wildlife. And we found one down in that ravine I was just mentioning. And I hadn't seen one in person before. I had no idea what it was. I just saw this green thing in Ned's mouth. And at the time, he was maybe about 5 months old or something. But out is one of the first things that I teach my dogs, because like I said, I have retrievers and they pick up anything and everything. So very early on, I teach them out. So by 5 months, he already had a very strong out command. We were just starting the bring it here, let me see game, but I didn't do it with that item because I wasn't sure what it was that he had. So I didn't want it in his mouth any longer than necessary. And I just told him out and he spat it out and he came running to me, and I gave him a couple of cookie rewards because, again, I wasn't sure what it was. So I really wanted to make sure I made an impression that what a good dog, you dropped that. That's great. And I went over to have a look, and of course, it was that rabies vaccination in the little green labeled container. So I was really glad at that point to have that drop at cue, because who knows what that could have been.
With our dogs, I will often sort of give them two out commands or drop it sort of commands. The out is a little bit less formal. It's a little bit more relaxed, where a drop it is definitive. And if you listen to our podcast or, trained with us or seen our YouTube channel, you'll know that we focus heavily on the recall, where you have a 100% reliable recall regardless of the distractions. But we also have an informal here, which is, a little less urgent and, a little bit more relaxed. So I essentially do the same thing with my training with those two, the drop it and the out. I can use an out when we're playing tug or when, something that's not that urgent, but I train that drop it so it happens immediately each and every time with our dogs. And I like to be able, personally, I like to be able to sort of have those two varying degrees of urgency with those out commands. But
definitely.
Yeah. So now the next name, I hope I don't butcher, but it's J. Rosary Prochaskova asks a great question. What do you think about leash dog-to-dog interactions?
We do not like them. I think we touched on this earlier with one of the other questions. It changes body posture, tight leash especially. It changes body posture. It can bring tension into the situation, because if a dog is trying to lean in to sniff and now they're being told they can't and being pulled back, that will often create some tension and some pressure in the scenario. So we've done a lot on allowing dogs to play with one another, things like that. And while dog to dog play is lovely with dogs that you know, I personally never allow my dogs to greet strange dogs. I just don't. It's not worth the risk to me. We're in an unfortunate position of having lots of access to stories and unfortunate scenarios, and dogs being bitten out and about on walks by dogs that, you know, their owners said, oh yeah, he's friendly, and then something just goes wrong. It's just not worth it to me with the number of times that I've heard things like that happening and heard of dogs being hurt. So I am very cautious with my dogs when we're out and about walking. If people say, oh, is your dog friendly? I just say no, and I keep walking. And there was a time where I would feel guilty about that. I would feel bad. I would feel like I was not being a very kind human being out there in the world, just telling people no. But at the end of the day, my responsibility is keeping my dogs safe. And if that means that I come across as a not so nice person when I'm out and about, I've come to terms with that. If you do have to allow your dog to greet another dog on leash, make sure, first off, you have a good response to name, so you can get your dog's attention back away from that scenario without putting pressure into the leash or without having to tighten up the leash. Make sure that you keep the leash loose for that greeting, and keep the greeting very short, something around 2 or 3 seconds maximum before on a loose lead you call that dog away. Personally, I don't even allow that with my dogs. If I'm going to allow them to play with other dogs, it's dogs that I know that are safe, and it's always off leash. And it's always after I have good enough control of my dog that they will listen to my voice 100%, regardless of whether or not they're in the middle of a wrestling match with that dog or not, because I want to make sure that if that play starts to escalate to a point that I don't like, I can shut it down immediately before anything bad happens.
I think for the amount of dogs that we see that have to come in for some sort of help to build confidence back, or alleviate some fear, there's lots and lots of situations where maybe 100 times that there's no issue with dog-to-dog interaction, but for that one, it's just not worth the risk. For that one time, the damage that can be done, and not just physically, because obviously there's some obvious physical damage that can happen, but the psychological damage that happens and just the bad experience. We're responsible for making sure that we are protecting our dogs and giving them the best life possible, and we do have to do sort of a risk assessment in this situation. What's the benefit of having them greet on leash? And there's really no benefit. It's standing on a sidewalk with both dogs on leash. So really take that to heart. Take Shannon's advice to heart, and consider either a different environment or not allowing your dogs to greet on leash. Now this sort of dovetails into looks like Michaela Batalgarin. I apologize for
I'm sure you got that right,
for reading the names. She asks, how do you manage and train a fearful dog? And this is a pretty broad question.
Yeah, and it's a tough one to answer, because I would not recommend anything as far as a blanket response. I can't give you anything other than stop the rehearsal of the behaviors if possible, and seek the advice of a qualified behaviorist so that you can have somebody to work through that with you. The problem with giving advice about behavioral things is that they change at the drop of a hat, and you need somebody who can change with them. So you need somebody who can watch the dog, and as they're seeing the body language develop, they can at that point say, okay, that's because of this. The dog is reacting because of this. It's reacting to this. Or they can at least point out the first second the dog is showing a reaction to that scenario. And that usually takes it takes some training. It takes some time in dogs to be able to recognize that really early body language. Most of us will be right on board knowing that the dog is fearful, worried, what have you, if they're, barking and backing away or they have their tail tucked. But you need to intervene with scenarios when you see something much earlier than that. So it might be a little bit of an ear pin back. It might be a little bit of whale eye. It's going to be something a lot more subtle. And those are the scenarios or those are the opportunities that you want to take to change the behavior. So I definitely recommend, if you've got a behavioral problem, any behavioral problem, don't try to work through it on your own. If you're not a professional, work through it with somebody who has behavioral training and who can recognize, read body language, and give you a program that allows you to tell the dog that when they're right and when they're wrong, and it allows you to set the dog up to be successful. So recognizing that early body language is what is going to make that dog be successful, so that you can intervene at that point. That would definitely be my advice for that, is seek a qualified behaviorist. It'll be well worth the investment in time and energy.
And when it comes to finding a behaviorist, do your research. There's very little regulation in the dog training industry. There's none, and anyone can call themselves a dog trainer, but just do a little investigation with that person who you want to train with. Experience is key, especially with these fearful dog situations, because some of those signs that Shannon gave to you independently, maybe barking and backing away, that may be a playful dog, but in the wrong perception, it's a collection of signs that you see that a dog trainer will see, and their experience will, guide their advice. So really be cautious as you're selecting a dog trainer in today's world, because that it can make or break that training experience for your dog. And you definitely want to be spending your hard-earned money the right way, for sure, because it can often be an expensive endeavor, but it needs to be done to help those fearful dogs. Now, something that I'd love to mention to our podcast audience is that Shannon has worked really hard on this very exciting thing to offer to you guys, and it's actually launching on March 1st. I don't know when you're listening to this podcast, but it's something that everyone who listens to our podcast can be a part of. And why don't you tell us a little bit about the announcement, Shannon?
If you can see me, you can see I'm just on the edge of my seat, waiting eagerly to drop the bomb on this one. We are releasing free workshops every month. We're going to have a free workshop delivered right to your inbox. So if you go to our website, you can connect to the email list to get on to be notified when we have the free workshops. The first one that's being released is an attention workshop, where we worked with all sorts of different drills and gave you the tools to get your dog to focus on you, whether you've asked for it, or in some scenarios, if you haven't asked for it, and how to get your dog to focus on you even when the distractions are tough and the things in the environment are potentially more desirable for the dog to look at than to look at you. We're going to work on teaching the dog that even in those scenarios, looking at you is still a much more reinforcing thing. So get signed up for that update list, and those workshops are coming. We're super excited about them.
Yeah, I'm really excited. I love being able. I love how amazing the community is when they say, I tried this, I was on on your Facebook page, or I read your blog and it really helped me. I love that. And I'm so excited to offer like step-by-step training within the training workshops, the free monthly training workshops that I'm pumped. I can't wait to get people. I know our McCann students have had access to this for about a week now, was it? And one of our students jumped into the workshop, and she just zoomed through it. She took every course or every video and worked her through it. And I was excited to see that. So if you are listening to the podcast, then I will pop a link in the show notes so that you can get to that, the free attention workshop, and get on the list for the free monthly workshops. And if you're watching this on our YouTube podcast, I'll drop a link in the description below. And if this is your first time on our YouTube podcast channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We publish new videos every single week to help you understand the why behind how dogs think and learn. And I want to thank Instructor Shannon, the Director of Online Training for McCann, for joining us today. I want to wish you guys happy training. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody.